I suppose I've always been a writer. Even when I was a boy, I tried to write a novel, and then in college I wrote another one which I actually finished. Along the way I did a lot of short stories. In fact, I've got boxes of them. And some journalism as well. I wrote a column for a local newspaper and wrote some journalism in college as well. When I got to med school, I would get up about 4 or 5 in the morning to try and take some time to get some writing done. And then in residency, I remember I chose a apartment that was close enough to the hospital so I could get up in the morning and have some time to write. The result was picking a neighborhood that was like something out of The Wire. By the time that I finished residency, I realized that if I'm going to kind of make a career going as a writer, I needed to focus, and the most obvious way to focus was on academic writing. And so I kind of focused on the work of a researcher, doing papers, presentations, talks, and essays. I'd heard about the story of William Beaumont when I was a boy, you know, the sort of mythic hero of a physician who saves a patient and does good. And then later, when I was a fellow in bioethics at the University of Chicago, I met this pediatric intensivist who liked to collect classics of medical history. And I remember he showed me his collection of classics, and one of them was Beaumont's Experiments and Observations book. And at the time, as I was doing the ethics fellowship, it sort of clicked to me as I looked at that, there's an interesting story here, and I just sort of filed it away. I sort of collect ideas, and that struck me as a good idea to hold on to. Well, you know, then I started my career in academic medicine and, you know, set aside writing fiction. But after about 6 years or so doing that, you know, things were working. The papers were being published, the research grants and projects, I think, were becoming more and more successful. And I started to get itchy and restless, and I kind of wanted to move on to some new writing. And I remember I went back into my notebook and said, you know, I filed that away, and now's the time to take on that story. So I began doing research about William Beaumont, and it was an interesting journey going from Beaumont, the mythic hero, to Beaumont, the real man, a much more complex and frankly real character. The biggest challenge was trying to get the sort of language right. You know, kind of what's the true way that people then spoke? And obviously, I don't have audio or video recordings from 1823 in northern Michigan that describe how people spoke and the words they used. Granted, part of my research was reading newspapers and other sort of primary sources to get a sense of the way people spoke and how they interacted. But I was really keen to get the language right for the times, so it was a credible language. So for example, the word okay, which is ubiquitous in our language now, back then, as best as I could tell, essentially didn't exist. So I was very keen, for example, to strike that word out. I also paid great attention to getting the medical and related scientific language right. It was easy to sort of suddenly find myself writing using more contemporary terms to describe things, but I was keen to kind of literally occupy the mind of an early 19th century physician and scientist, and that was quite a lot of fun to do. Well, we go to nonfiction for the facts, and we go to fiction for the truth. And I actually did consider initially writing it as a nonfiction book, but the more I read the story, the history, excuse me, the more I wanted to sort of tell the story. You know, I started out with Beaumont as this sort of, I originally composed this book where he was this, you know, sort of underdog who, despite all odds, did what was right, and, you know, tried to make the world a better place. But the more I sort of read about the facts of the man, the more the story became interesting, that he was a very complicated man. And I thought, you know, if you really want to tell what the truth is about not just William Beaumont, but people like William Beaumont, the most effective way to convey that was with story as opposed to history. In some sense, I didn't want the facts to get in the way of the truth. Some basic things, I could kind of get my head around what Beaumont went through when he first met Alexis and was taking care of him, and the efforts to treat him. I could also get a handle, even though the medicine he practiced was completely foreign to what I do now, I could get a sense of what he went through to become a physician. So those things helped. Like the character I could kind of occupy fairly easily in that sense. The other aspect, though, of medicine that I found very helpful is, you know, essentially the medical encounter, especially as I engage in it, is very what we kind of call bedside medicine. You know, patient comes to me with their complaint, I'm having a memory problem. And then my job is to get them to tell their story. So it's not me actually talking, it's them talking with me asking the questions along the way. One of the standard questions I ask patients and their families is, what's a typical day? And out of that I get this very vivid story about what a typical day is. And my job as the writer, the physician, is to take that very unique individual narrative and make sense of it and tell a story of someone's disease, where the end of the story in a patient's case is, well, what do I think the problem is and what are we going to do about it? Of course, that's very different than what the end of the story is for any given novel. But I think there's a lot of similarities between the act of gathering a history and making it into a coherent story that explains a patient's story of illness, and the act of sitting down and saying, I want to write the story of William Beaumont as an ambitious American fueled by that passion and what that says about what it means to be an American coming up from humble, simple roots. William Beaumont wasn't a bad man, but he wasn't a great man. He was just a man, like most of us, a mixture of the bad and the good. He was a complicated character. He came from humble roots, a simple farming, rural farming community in Connecticut, struggled to kind of make it on his own on what was then the frontier of northern New York State, struggled to kind of find a trade that he could excel in and make money, and in some sense almost stumbled on the sort of role of training to be a physician as an apprentice, but then stuck with it. Fortuitously became a surgeon's mate in the War of 1812 and got a lot of probably on-the-job training in being a surgeon and physician. He's a complicated guy. I mean, he wanted to make it. He came from simple roots, and he had to make some tough choices. And luck, frankly, handed him Alexis Saint-Martin, and I think he recognized not only something that was part of his responsibility as a physician, that is to say, take care of a patient, but I think he also recognized something bigger and larger and different, which I think he had a hard time getting his ethics around, which was how to, frankly, use this man to create something bigger and greater. And his life story is a complicated one, but I think it's the story of many ambitious, hardworking Americans who, want to make it in the world, provided they're given the sort of opportunity that a free nation of free and equal people allow us to have. They do. Certainly the particulars are dramatically different. The kind of medicine that Beaumont practiced now seems, frankly, entirely unscientific. But though those particulars are very different, the core kind of issues remain. Namely, how do you advance your career and advance science? And those two tend to be very intermingled, even more so now, where physicians, scientists can make great profit from their research by patenting their results and otherwise spinning off companies. But how do you do that activity while at the same time respecting the dignity and rights of the people who make that research possible, the people that we call subjects or participants? And that fundamental ethical, frankly, I think moral challenge was present there when William Beaumont met Alexis Saint-Martin, and it's still present now when people like myself and my colleagues try to move our science along.